Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
Have you ever noticed this incredibly frustrating, almost cruel paradox about trying to change your life?
Oh, I think we all have, yeah.
Right. You finally make the big decision. You decide to quit a bad habit that's been dragging you down, or maybe you finally draw a hard boundary to end a toxic dynamic with a friend or colleague.
Or even just trying to radically shift your own internal mindset.
Exactly. And because you've made this positive choice, you expect to feel immediate relief. You imagine walking into this quiet, peaceful room in your mind where there used to be, a constant shouting match. But instead, the exact opposite happens. The exact opposite. The urge to do the thing you just quit gets 10 times louder. The internal pressure intensifies to a degree that feels unbearable.
You feel more agitated?
More desperate. And ultimately, you start to feel like you are actively failing. You sit there thinking, if this was the right choice, if I am finally on the right path, why does it feel so terrible?
It is arguably one of the most universally misunderstood experiences of being human. And because we misunderstand it, we misread that intense discomfort.
We take it as a flashing warning sign.
Right, a sign that we're moving backward. Or we internalize it as proof that we simply don't have the willpower to change. We think that discomfort is an accusation.
But what if that intense, awful feeling isn't a sign of failure at all?
What if it's actually a precise, highly predictable mechanical feature of the way your brain learns?
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. For this deep dive, we are looking at a fascinating stack of sources authored by Professor R.J. Starr.
It's a really incredible body of work.
It is. We have an essay, a peer-reviewed academic paper, and a transcript from his own audio work. All of it is centered around decoding a specific psychological phenomenon known as the extinction burst.
Now, I know many of you listening are already familiar with the baseline concept of an extinction burst from, standard Psych 101.
But the sources we have today take this to an entirely different level.
Our mission today is to thoroughly explore R.J. Starr's cutting-edge research. Specifically, we're focusing on what he calls the multi-level psychological model of reinforcement collapse.
It's quite a mouthful, but it is so important.
It really is. We are going to look at how this model integrates different layers of our psychology, moving all the way from our raw biology up to our complex sense of identity.
And all of this fits within his broader framework of psychological architecture.
Exactly. The goal here is to help you understand that when things get intensely difficult during a transition, it is not a referendum on your character. It is the psychological architecture of change at work.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because as I mentioned, the baseline concept of an extinction burst isn't exactly breaking news for anyone who follows behavioral science.
Right.
But we should do a very quick level set before we jump into the deeply human advanced layers that R.J. Starr maps out. So just to ground us, what is the textbook definition of an extinction burst before human complexity gets involved?
At its most basic behavioral level, an extinction burst is a temporary escalation of a previously reinforced behavior following the sudden withdrawal of that reinforcement.
Put simply,
when a behavior that always produced a specific outcome suddenly stops working, the biological system doesn't just quietly say, oh, well, and abandon the behavior.
it temporarily intensifies it.
It escalates the effort, the frequency, or the physical intensity of the action.
Right. The classic analogy that Starr briefly touches on, and we all know this one, is the broken vending machine.
Yes, the vending machine.
You put your money in, you press the button for your favorite snack, and you expect the snack to drop. You do X, you get Y. But this time, nothing comes out. The machine just sits there.
And as we all know, you don't just calmly nod, accept the mechanical failure, and walk away.
No. You press the button again, but harder. Then you press it rapidly. You might grab the machine and shake it. That escalation, that frantic button mashing is the extinction burst.
And of course, the foundational science here goes back to B.F. Skinner's laboratory with the pigeons.
Right, the pigeons.
He trained them to peck a button for food. When he stopped the food, the pigeons didn't stop pecking. They pecked harder, faster, and much more erratically before finally giving up.
But the crucial thing to pull from this baseline before we move into Starr's work is the why.
Why do pigeons and humans at a vending machine react this way?
I was actually wondering about that as I read the Introduction to Stars paper. Why isn't a brain, especially an advanced human brain, smart enough to just recognize a broken rule and move on immediately?
Because the brain treats reinforcement as a binding contract with reality.
A binding contract.
Yes, learning systems, from an evolutionary standpoint, are incredibly conservative. They're designed to preserve rules that have successfully kept the organism alive and functioning up to this point.
So when you suddenly stop getting the expected reward,
The brain's first assumption is not that the fundamental laws of the universe have permanently changed. The brain's assumption is there must be a glitch. I need to test the rule with more effort.
it applies a known, previously successful strategy more forcefully.
Exactly, to differentiate between a temporary environmental disruption and a genuine permanent change.
That actually makes total sense when you frame it around survival. If an animal is digging for roots in a patch of dirt that has always provided roots, and one day they don't find any in the first few minutes, they shouldn't just shrug and walk away to starve.
Right, they'd die.
They should dig harder, at least for a little while, to test if the roots are just buried deeper today. The escalation is actually a protective survival mechanism.
Precisely. It is a highly conservative feature of learning. The system demands that the rule be tested under stress before it is willing to discard a strategy that has historically kept you alive.
But I want to pivot us here because this is where the sources get really dense and fascinating. While humans and pigeons share this baseline behavioral response, human beings complicate things immensely.
We really do.
We don't just peck buttons for food. Our behaviors are tangled up with our emotions, our swirling thoughts, and our incredibly fragile sense of self. And this perfectly tees up the core of our deep dive today.
Yes, and this is where R.J. Starr's research really changes the paradigm. Traditional behavioral psychology, the vending machine and the pigeon, is simply too narrow to explain what happens in a human being during a major life transition.
It describes the external behavior beautifully.
But it completely fails to account for the internal subjective experience. This is why Starr's multi-level psychological model of reinforcement collapse is such a breakthrough.
He integrates multiple layers.
He integrates multiple layers of human experience within his broader psychological architecture framework to explain not just what we do during an extinction burst, but why it feels so uniquely overwhelming and personal.
So I want to spend a significant amount of time breaking down this model, layer by layer, starting from the ground up. In his paper, layer 1 of Starr's model is the neural layer. What is actually happening in our physical brain circuitry when this reinforcement collapses?
At the neural level, the sudden collapse of reinforcement triggers what neuroscientists call a negative reward prediction error. Now, our dopaminergic systems are constantly running in the background, anticipating outcomes based on past experience.
Let me pause you right there, because negative reward prediction error sounds like an error code on a very depressing computer.
It does sound like that.
Can we unpack what that actually means for the organic brain?
Absolutely. We often think of dopamine as just the pleasure chemical, but it's actually much more about motivation, craving, and prediction.
Your brain is essentially a prediction machine.
It is. It says, if I open this app, I will see a funny video. Or, if I drink this wine, I will feel relaxed. When you expect a reward and it fails to materialize, say you decide not to pour that glass of wine, your brain has guessed wrong.
That is the prediction error.
And negative simply means there is a deficit. You got less than you expected. When this happens, the dopamine system doesn't just quietly shut down and recalibrate.
It spikes in frustration.
It creates a literal neurological discrepancy that acts as an alarm bell, signaling that something in the environment is wrong and driving a massive urge to try harder to get the expected outcome.
So it's like ordering a package online, getting the notification that it was delivered, but you open your front door and the porch is empty.
That's exactly it.
You don't just say, oh, well, your brain glitches. You check the tracking number again, you look behind the planter, you check the neighbor's porch. Your brain is experiencing a deficit between the prediction and reality.
That is a perfect analogy. And that neurological spike, that frantic searching behind the planter, immediately triggers layer 2 of Starr's model, the affective layer.
The emotional systems.
This is where the emotional systems mobilize urgency. The brain essentially dumps a flood of heightened arousal, frustration, and physical agitation into the body.
And reading through Starr's essay, this neural and affective cascade seems to be exactly why an extinction burst feels so physically compelling.
Yes.
It is not just a passing intellectual thought of, I'd sort of like to do that old habit. It is an embodied demand. Your chest might feel tight. Your heart rate elevates. You feel restless. It feels like a literal emergency.
What's fascinating here is the concept of a biological lag.
A lag.
Yeah. The content mind, the prefrontal cortex, might have made a very clear, rational choice to change. You decided, I am not going to text my ex anymore.
Right.
But your nervous system is still operating on outdated information. There is a profound lag between the moment of conscious decision and the moment of neurological recalibration.
Oh, wow.
Your nervous system hasn't updated its expectations yet. So when you don't text them, your body registers a negative reward prediction error and floods you with the effective urgency to restore the old pattern.
The conscious mind has turned the steering wheel, but the heavy machinery of the nervous system is still sliding forward on the ice.
Exactly.
The sources bring up addiction studies to illustrate this, and the data is pretty wild. It shows that cravings for a substance often peak right before they start to decline.
That's right.
When someone quits smoking, the brain frantically scrambles to reestablish the old dopamine pattern. It amplifies the craving, making it louder, sharper, and more intense than ever.
It's a last-ditch effort to force the body to get the reinforcement back before the brain finally accepts that it has to let the old neural pathway die.
And if we were just biological machines, the story would end there. We would feel the physical craving, ride out the agitation, and eventually the dopamine system would update.
But human beings cannot simply tolerate unexplained physical arousal. We have a profound need to interpret what is happening in our bodies.
And that brings us to the higher order functions in R.J. Starr's multi-level psychological model of reinforcement collapse.
Which is where things get really complicated.
Right, the psychological software running on top of the biological hardware. This moves us to layer 3 in Starr's framework, the cognitive layer. As I understand it, the mind absolutely abhors ambiguity.
It really does.
When it feels this intense physical urge, this affective flood, it tries to generate a causal explanation for why we feel so terrible.
Exactly. Ambiguity invites effort. The mind feels this intense physical pressure and thinks, I feel this massive urgency, therefore there must be a critical problem I need to solve.
It doesn't naturally interpret the physical discomfort as a sign of neurological learning.
No, it interprets it as a call for immediate correction.
Yeah.
It starts generating narratives to justify the physical feeling. It says, you feel anxious because you really need to check your email right now, or you feel angry because your boundary is too harsh.
And this cognitive rationalization bleeds directly into layer 4, which I found to be the absolute most compelling part of Starr's entire framework.
The identity layer.
Yes, the identity layer.
It is the linchpin of his research. For humans, behaviors are rarely just neutral, transactional actions. They carry immense identity claims.
Think about how deeply we are socialized from a very young age. We are taught to equate effort with competence. We equate persistence with strength of character.
Exactly.
When a behavior suddenly stops working and we experience an extinction burst, it is not just the behavior that destabilizes, it is our entire self-coherence.
This cultural trap is so deeply ingrained, I don't think we even notice it most of the time.
From childhood, we are fed this narrative that quitting is a moral failure. Giving up is synonymous with weakness.
Trying harder, pushing through, refusing to take no for an answer. These are framed as the ultimate virtues.
Therefore, during an extinction burst, when your brain is screaming at you to escalate a failing behavior, it doesn't feel like you are doing something mathematically inefficient.
It feels like the responsible, virtuous, morally correct thing to do.
You tell yourself, I am not giving up. I am doing what has always been required of a strong person. The escalation takes on this heavy moral weight.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is precisely where the experience morphs from a technical feature of learning into a full-blown existential crisis.
Right.
When someone's sense of self is fundamentally organized around being capable or being the fixer in a family or being a relentless problem solver, and their strategy suddenly stops working, their very identity is threatened.
They escalate the behavior not just to get the superficial reward, but to defend their core story about who they are. There is a quote from R.J. Starr in the essay that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. I want to read it exactly as he wrote it because it is so incredibly poignant. He writes, "We mistake the debris of a collapsing structure for the foundation of our soul."
It is a phenomenal observation.
I just had to sit with that for a minute when I read it. We look at our frantic cravings, our jagged temper during a life transition, or our desperate attempts to control a situation that is slipping away, and we assume this ugly, chaotic intensity is our true self being revealed.
We think, oh God, underneath it all, this must be who I really am. I am weak, I am angry, I am out of control.
It captures the absolute most brutal phase of the human learning process.
In that moment, you don't just fear that your specific strategy is failing. You deeply fear that you are a failed strategy.
Wow.
You interpret the surge of effort, the anger, or the craving as undeniable proof that you are fundamentally broken and incapable of change.
But STAR's psychological architecture framework reveals that this is a complete and total misdiagnosis of the situation.
Completely. What you think is an existential crisis, a dark revelation of your weakest self, is often just a predictive learning system under extreme mechanical strain.
It is simply a biological and psychological system reaching the absolute boundary of what it knows how to do and flailing as it tries to map new territory.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this identity crisis, this fear that we are fundamentally flawed, causes us to completely misread our own progress.
The sources spend a lot of time discussing how this leads us into what Starr calls the illusion of regression.
The illusion of regression stems from a very faulty yet universally held assumption that progress must be linear.
Right.
We hold this deeply seated belief that if a change is genuinely working, things should steadily get easier day by day, and discomfort should diminish in a neat straight line.
Therefore, if we suddenly feel worse, if on day 10 the urge intensifies or the distress spikes to a level higher than day 1, we immediately conclude that we are sliding backward.
That is so relatable. If I am trying to change how I react to a highly critical family member, and I've been doing well for a few weeks, but suddenly one afternoon I feel more furious and reactive and triggered than I did a month ago, my immediate thought is, well, I've lost all my progress, I'm regressing, the therapy isn't working.
But Starr outlines how this leads to incredibly common misinterpretations of our own internal state. We label this spike in discomfort as self-sabotage.
We assume it's some deep, unresolved childhood pathology bubbling up to the surface.
We think it's a lack of true commitment on our part, or we even mystify it and call it a warning from the universe telling us that we are on the wrong path and need to turn back.
And this is where Starr asks us to radically dismantle the equation that intensity equals truth.
Intensity equals truth.
In our culture, we tend to assume that the louder the impulse, the more entrenched and powerful the old pattern must be. We think a screaming urge is a sign of an unbeatable habit.
But from a behavioral and neurological standpoint, that equation is entirely backward.
Completely backward. A system that is confident in a rule does not need to shout. It applies the rule quietly, smoothly, and reliably.
Escalation, intense physical urgency, frantic cognitive rationalization, these are actually signs of profound instability.
They are signs that the old habit is degrading and losing its structural integrity, not that it is strong.
That is such a vital flip in perspective. Intensity is a sign of instability. The old habit is basically throwing a massive tantrum because it knows it's losing power.
It's like a dictator in the final days of a regime. The rules are enforced with the most chaotic violence right before the collapse.
But the sources also highlight an immense danger here, specifically regarding the concept of intermittent reinforcement. What happens to our psychological architecture if we misinterpret that intense discomfort as a sign to go back to the old way?
If you give in to the discomfort just to make the internal noise stop, you do the most damaging thing mathematically possible to your own learning cycle. You reset it, but you reset it worse.
You reset it worse.
By giving in, when the escalation is at its absolute peak, you teach your brain that escalation works.
Oh.
You teach the system that if it just pushes you hard enough, if it just makes you miserable enough, you will eventually cave and provide the reinforcement.
This is the very definition of intermittent reinforcement, and it is known to create the most stubborn, hard-to-break, addictive habits in existence.
You don't just postpone the transition, you armor the old habit, making the next attempt to quit exponentially harder.
I want to highlight an analogy used in the sources to explain this because it gave me such a clear visual. The noisy engine versus the failing plane.
I love that one.
When you hit an extinction burst, the panic and intensity you feel is just a noisy engine. It's incredibly loud, it's rattling your teeth, it's terrifying to sit inside of, but it is not a sign that the plane is going down.
The structural integrity of the aircraft is perfectly fine.
You don't need to strap on a parachute and jump out into the freezing air just because the decibels in the cabin rise. The structure is sound. The system is just recalibrating its altitude.
I think that captures it perfectly. The psychological system is no longer at home in the old pattern, even if it is temporarily returning there to bang on the doors and test the locks.
The internal context has already changed.
It is vital for anyone going through this to recognize that you feel worse, not because the old strategy is succeeding in pulling you back, but precisely because the old strategy is finally failing to provide the comfort and numbing effect it once did. The noise is the sound of the strategy breaking, not winning.
So let me ask you, the listener, directly. Think about your own life. How many times have you decided to change your life, tried a new path, sworn you were going to do things differently, but you quit in that destabilizing, messy middle simply because you misread the internal signals?
How many times did you jump out of a perfectly good plane just because the engine got a little loud?
Let's take these dense concepts from R.J. Starr's multi-level psychological model of reinforcement collapse and look at how this escalation plays out in real life, across different spheres, because it manifests in fascinating ways.
It is incredibly clarifying to apply this framework to specific, everyday situations. Let's start with individual habits, which is where most people will recognize this immediately.
The essay gives a fantastic, highly relatable example of deleting a social media app.
You realize you are spending way too much time doom scrolling. It's affecting your sleep, so you make the conscious choice to delete the app. You expect to feel free, maybe a little lighter.
But by mid-afternoon, you find yourself picking up your phone, unconsciously swiping to the exact empty space on your screen where the app icon used to.
And you end up checking your phone 10 times more often than you did when you actually had the app installed.
Yes, I have lived this exact scenario. You delete the app and suddenly you are checking your email refresh button, you're looking at the weather app for cities you don't live in, you're opening the calculator app just to have something to look at.
It is a frantic, almost embarrassing seeking behavior.
And the cognitive layer kicks in, right? You start justifying reinstalling the app just to check one important message, telling yourself you'll delete it right after.
That is a classic textbook habit extinction burst. Your brain is experiencing a negative reward prediction error, and it is desperately trying to restore the dopamine hit of the scroll.
It's not a failure of your character or a lack of willpower. It is the biological system stress testing the environment to see if the old rule can somehow be revived.
Now, if we scale this up to interpersonal relationships, the framework becomes deeply complex and, frankly, incredibly illuminating.
What happens when the broken vending machine is actually another human being?
Let's say you were trying to set a boundary. You have a friend or a family member who expects you to drop everything and reply to their texts immediately, day or night.
You finally decide, for your own mental health, to set a boundary. You stop replying right away to prioritize your own time and focus.
And in a perfect world, they would just think, oh, they must be busy. I'll hear from them later.
But that never happens.
Instead, they trigger what Starr terms a social extinction burst.
They send one text, no reply. They send another 10 minutes later. Then single question mark. Then 3 more texts in rapid succession.
They might escalate to sending a passive-aggressive meme, or calling you repeatedly, or even reaching out to a mutual friend to ask if you are mad at them.
They are completely accustomed to the usual reinforcement, your immediate, undivided attention. And when it is suddenly withdrawn, they push much harder to force the expected outcome.
This dynamic reveals something profound about human interactions, particularly in power dynamics or toxic controlling relationships.
Right.
When a controlling person loses their grip, when their usual tactics of manipulation, guilt-tripping, or anger stop working because you have changed your response, they rarely step away quietly.
They do not gracefully accept the loss of power.
They escalate their demands. They might lash out, become extremely volatile, or conversely become overwhelmingly cloying and needy.
They're testing the system to see if their old rule of control can be reinstated if they just apply more force or a different flavor of pressure.
Which is absolutely terrifying and exhausting when you're on the receiving end of it.
But think about how incredibly empowering it is to view their bad behavior through the lens of R.J. Starr's framework.
Yes.
If someone is losing their mind because you set a reasonable boundary, you don't have to react emotionally or internalize their chaos. You can look at them, or look at your phone blowing up with their texts and think, this is just their extinction burst.
Their psychological architecture is experiencing a negative reward prediction error.
Their system is realizing the old rules of controlling me don't work anymore, and they are panicking. It fosters this incredible sense of detachment and patience.
You can just watch the noisy engine rattle without assuming the plane is going down.
It truly alters the fundamental nature of the interaction. You stop seeing their escalation as a valid reason to cave or apologize, and you start seeing it as objective, empirical proof that your boundary is actually working.
And this raises an important point. The same principle applies even at the macro level, in society and the workplace.
When a company, an institution, or a government implements a major reform or a new policy that disrupts the status quo, there is almost always a massive, disproportionate spike in pushback, complaints, and organizational resistance.
You see it in every corporate restructuring. People dig their heels in. They say, this new software is never going to work. The old way was so much better. This is a disaster.
It is a societal extinction burst. The collective system is escalating its behavior to protect the known rules.
But, as the sources point out, if leadership understands this framework, holds firm, and doesn't cave to the initial wave of intense backlash, that resistance is very often the final, loudest gasp before the new norms are integrated and stabilize.
The loudest, most aggressive resistance almost always happens right before the change permanently takes hold.
So we have all this theory, all this understanding of the neurobiology and the identity mechanics, but what does this all mean for us functionally?
How do we actually use R.J. Starr's insights to survive these transitional bursts when we're in the thick of them?
Because, as Starr is very careful to point out in his paper, simply understanding what an extinction burst is from an academic standpoint does not magically make the intense discomfort go away.
Right, and I appreciated that hard truth from the sources. Reading about the multi-level psychological model of reinforcement collapse does not act as a painkiller.
The urgency does not just dissolve on command because you correctly labeled it.
The physical agitation, the chest tightness, the craving, the anger, it's still going to be there. But Starr argues that what this understanding does change is your fundamental orientation to the discomfort.
It shifts the entire subjective experience from an accusation to an observation.
That is the crux of the practical application. Before you understand this model, the discomfort feels like a direct accusation from your own mind. I am failing. I am weak. I am broken.
It carries an unbearable moral judgment.
But after you understand the mechanics of the extinction burst, the discomfort becomes an observation. My biological system is recalibrating. My predictive architecture is updating its software.
You still feel the pain, you still feel the heat of the fire, but it loses its existential meaning as a sign of your own failure. It is just weather passing through the nervous system.
And because you no longer see it as a moral failure or a sign of impending doom, you don't panic and rush to hit the escape hatch.
You don't reinstall the app, you don't text the toxic ex back, you don't cave to the tantrum.
But you also can't just sit there in a static void of pure willpower. Nature abhors a vacuum.
Starr emphasizes the vital importance of replacement.
When you abandon an old habit and you are riding out the turbulence of the extinction burst, you must actively replace the old behavior with a new, positively reinforced one.
Yes, the brain needs a new pathway to direct all that mobilized effective energy. If you are quitting smoking, the urge will spike, the agitation will flood your body.
Instead of just gritting your teeth and white-knuckling it, which is exhausting and often fails, you replace the physical ritual.
You do deep breathing, you hold a specific object, you immediately go for a brisk walk, you give the nervous system a new action to map onto the physical arousal.
This connects back to a brilliant distinction Starr makes between sensation and instruction.
Bodily urgency you feel during a burst is a state, a sensation. It is purely informational.
It is telling you that a historical rule has been broken, but it is not an instruction. It is not a command from a higher authority that you have to act on.
I love that phrasing so much. Sensation, not instruction.
Just because my body is demanding I check my phone or my chest is tight with the urge to argue with someone doesn't mean I have to obey the sensation.
It completely reframes the entire concept of persistence for me.
In our culture, we usually think of persistence as raw, aggressive willpower, forcing a new behavior to happen through sheer force.
But in the context of an extinction burst, persistence is actually much quieter. It is simply having the tolerance to sit with uncertainty.
It's the ability to just hold still, observe the sensation without obeying it, and wait while the old behavior loses its coherence and degrades.
It's exactly like the classic textbook parenting example of a toddler throwing a tantrum in the middle of a crowded grocery store because they want a candy bar.
If the parent gets embarrassed by the noise and gives in to the screaming child, they guarantee that the very next tantrum will be louder, longer, and happen sooner.
They have inadvertently reinforced the escalation.
But if the parent holds firm, the child will escalate the screaming, they might throw themselves on the floor, kick their feet. They will hit the absolute peak of the extinction burst.
But by patiently sitting with that severe discomfort, enduring the stares of other shoppers, and holding the boundary, the parent pushes the behavior to extinction.
The child eventually, inevitably, learns that the rule has permanently changed, and the screaming stops working.
It's all about riding out that agonizing peak without caving.
So let's look at the big picture here as we wrap up. R.J. Starr's research provides a massive, life-altering paradigm shift for anyone trying to improve their circumstances.
We have spent our entire lives conditioned to think that resistance, both internal and external, is a solid brick wall telling us to turn back and go home.
But understanding the extinction burst shows us that when something, a habit, a relationship dynamic, a societal norm, is on the very verge of extinction, it fights the absolute hardest to survive.
That intense pushback isn't a wall designed to keep you out. It's a threshold you are required to walk through.
It is the door to the new baseline.
It completely changes everything about how we interpret difficulty and friction in our lives. The escalation is simply the psychological system's final, desperate attempt to recover a reinforcement structure that no longer exists in reality.
When you feel that incredible intensity, it doesn't mean you are failing. It means the old way is finally dying.
So to you listening, the next time you try to make a meaningful change and you feel that overwhelming, suffocating urge to quit,
the next time you feel like you are regressing and everything's getting exponentially worse, remember R.J. Starr's work. Remember the psychological architecture of change.
you might not be failing at all. You might actually be on the very edge of a massive breakthrough.
The noise in the engine is deafening, the turbulence is shaking the cabin, but the ship isn't sinking. It's finally leaving the harbor. You are recalibrating.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the incredible architecture we've discussed today.
If an extinction burst requires so much intense, frantic, biological, and emotional energy from our psychological system just to keep an old, dying habit alive.
Imagine what happens when you finally cross that threshold. Does all that wasted, frantic energy simply dissipate into nothing? Or does it become the exact high-octane fuel you need to rapidly build your new reality?
Think about what you could do, what you could build with all that reclaimed power once you stop using it to desperately hammer on a broken bench.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.